Right, let's jump straight into this explainer. We tend to think of the executive branch as this rigid, unchanging thing, right? Like it's strictly defined by the Constitution and that's it. But the reality is actually way more fluid. The power of the American presidency has been stretched, fractured, and totally reshaped by the actual people sitting behind the desk. Today, we're looking at three specific and honestly often misunderstood leaders who radically transformed the office.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the evolution of executive power, look at how James K. Polk expanded the presidency, dive into Millard Fillmore's fatal compromise, explore Warren G. Harding's scandals, and finally, talk about restoring executive balance.
Okay, Section 1. The evolution of executive power, beyond the famous faces.
When we think about who shaped executive power, our minds naturally go straight to the heavy hitters, right? Washington, Lincoln, FDR, but the major structural changes to the presidency weren't just made by the guys on Mount Rushmore. So the big question is, how did three lesser-known presidents, James K. Polk, Millard Fillmore, and Warren G. Harding, permanently alter the power of the executive branch? Each of these guys faced massive national crises, or, unique opportunities, and how they responded left a permanent mark on what a president actually can and cannot do. Let's find out.
Moving on to Section 2. Polk expands the presidency. The dark horse takes charge.
All right, let's look at our 11th president, James K. Polk. Now, he took office in 1845 as a dark horse compromise candidate. Honestly, nobody really expected him to be a powerhouse. But Polk basically uncovered these latent constitutional powers of the presidency. He was, for lack of a better term, the ultimate micromanager. Before him, Congress usually ran the show, but Polk completely flipped that dynamic. He single-handedly provoked the Mexican-American War, got Congress to back it, picked the generals, and literally shaped the military strategy himself, which is wild because he had zero formal military training. All of this while keeping a super tight leash on Congress using his veto power and political patronage.
Just look at this quote. "Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon American soil." Polk used this exact, very calculated claim to get a really swift congressional declaration of war. He pushed this narrative so incredibly hard that Congress overwhelmingly approved it. But there was fierce pushback from anti-slavery Whigs. In fact, one of those critics was a young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, who actually challenged Polk to show him the exact spot where American blood had supposedly been spilled. Regardless of the pushback, Polk's aggressive executive action brought in massive territorial gains. With just the stroke of a pen on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, he added a staggering 1.2 million square miles to the U.S. We're talking California, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of several other future states. He literally expanded the nation by more than a third. It just goes to show you exactly how much a single determined president could alter the entire trajectory of the country.
Which brings us to Section 3, Fillmore and the Fatal Compromise, a presidency fractured.
Let's fast forward a bit to 1850. So while Polk expanded the map, Millard Fillmore inherited a country that was practically tearing itself apart over those exact same new territories. Fillmore actually became president after Zachary Taylor suddenly died in office. And the absolute defining moment of Fillmore's time in power was this massive political compromise. It was designed to stop the South from seceding, but it totally backfired, ultimately destroying his own Whig Party and really throwing gas on the fire leading up to the Civil War.
A huge part of that was Fillmore signing the deeply controversial Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 into law. And guys, this law was absolutely draconian. It suspended habeas corpus for the accused, meaning Black Americans had virtually no legal way to fight off false accusations. It overruled local laws up north, penalized state officials who refused to comply, and shockingly, even paid financial rewards to officers who captured alleged runaways. And Fillmore? He promised to use the full weight of his legal power to enforce it and crush any opposition.
Now, the contrast here between what he intended and what actually happened is just staggering. Here's the thing. Fillmore personally opposed slavery. He completely understood how evil the institution was. But he signed the act anyway, purely as a political calculation. It was a compromise meant to save the Union and keep his party together. Well, it backfired spectacularly. It set off a massive wave of Northern protests, totally alienated the anti-slavery wing of his party, and effectively guaranteed he'd be the very last Whig president in American history.
All right, jumping into Section 4. Harding Scandals and Surprises, the 1920s Paradox.
Let's jump way forward into the 1920s. Our 29th president, Warren G. Harding, is such a fascinating paradox. To put it bluntly, he was an incredibly poor judge of character. He basically just appointed his poker buddies and campaign donors, this group famously known as the Ohio Gang, to top government jobs. And the result? Unprecedented scandals. The most notorious, of course, was Teapot Dome, where his interior secretary literally took huge bribes to lease out federal naval oil reserves using private no-bid contracts. Plus, the head of the Veterans Bureau was caught stealing funds, and his attorney general was tangled up in selling immunities. Just a mess.
But history is rarely just black and white, right? If we actually look past the massive corruption, Harding did some surprising things to modernize the executive branch. For instance, he signed the 1921 Budget and Accounting Act. This was huge because it established the country's very first formal budgeting process, giving the president way more control over federal spending. On top of that, he actively started reversing the segregationist policies that Woodrow Wilson had put in place within the federal civil service.
And then there's this truly astonishing moment in the fall of 1921. Harding became the first sitting president since the Civil War to travel to the Deep South. He was speaking to a segregated crowd of over 30,000 people in Birmingham, Alabama. Instead of giving his standard speech about industry, he delivered this incredibly bold call for political, educational, and economic equality. Listen to this. Let the black man vote when he is fit to vote and prohibit the white man voting when he is unfit to vote. Saying that in the Jim Crow South in 1921, it was unbelievably dangerous and bold.
As you might guess, the immediate reaction was intensely divided. The press noted that the white audience met his words with stony silence, while the black audience members erupted in uproarious applause. Now, to be clear, Harding wasn't pushing for full social equality here, but just suggesting political and economic fairness was enough to completely enrage white Southerners. But for many black Americans, it was a monumental shift. Major Adam E. Patterson even went as far as comparing the impact of Harding's speech to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address.
Finally, Section 5, Restoring the Executive Balance, Looking Back.
So as we look back at these three presidencies, a really clear pattern emerges. The American presidency is definitely not a static office. It bends, it expands, and sometimes it outright breaks, depending on the character of whoever happens to be sitting behind the resolute desk. We saw Polk stretch the commander-in-chief powers to physically expand the map. We saw Fillmore's calculated political compromises literally fracture his own party. And we saw Harding deliver this chaotic mix of daring civil rights rhetoric alongside some of the absolute worst cronyism in government history.
So, I'm going to leave you with this thought as we wrap up today's explainer. The executive branch we have right now was built on top of all these messy, complicated historical foundations. If the power of the presidency is defined not just by the Constitution, but by the pen strokes, compromises, and even the friends of the presidents themselves, what precedent is being set today? As we watch the modern executive branch operate and push the boundaries of its power, which of these historical echoes do you hear the loudest? Keep your eyes peeled, because you know what they say, history is always repeating itself.